Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about India's foreign relations, India's major strategic partnerships, and India's involvement in shaping a better world order. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up a grand theme of Indian foreign policy, which is the aspiration to become a leading power in the world. Leading power is a phrase coined by the Narendra Modi government since 2014 to denote India's ambitions to be an important player on the world stage, to shape the emerging world order, major rules and regulations and institutions, and also to emerge as a power center in its own right rather than just a swing state that is balancing between existing power centers. Viewers, to take you through this discussion on India as a leading power, I have a very special guest in the studio. Let me introduce you to her. Dr. Tanvi Madan. Dr. Tanvi Madan is director of the India project at the Brookings institution, a very important think tank in the United States based in Washington, D.C. She's also author of an important book called Fateful Triangle about the relationship, triangular relationship of China, India and the United States during the Cold War period. Welcome to Indian Diplomacy, Dr. Madan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaulia. It's wonderful to be on the show.
Dr. Madan, India as a leading power, this theme, we stated the ambition up front for the first time, saying we have a target, and it's been 8 years now and it's work in progress, but people are seeing some kind of there's a lot of upbeat sentiment, and it looks like we are on the march and we are on the way to becoming a leading power, as Prime Minister Modi, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, many others have been saying that this is happening, and it's also been corroborated by a lot of international viewpoints and opinions. Many think tanks, consultancies are saying that this is India's time and it's finally getting its act together and approaching this goalpost of being a leading power. So, and why do you think this is happening now? I mean, in the second decade of it's probably it's been building up over time, accumulating, but this juncture, we are in 2023, it seems like it's India's moment. I mean, I was reading Morgan Stanley assessment saying this is India's decade, and then there's some saying, McKinsey is saying it's going to be India's century. So while there is doom and gloom in the western part of the world, and also worry about China's sustained growth in the future given its slowing demographics and other problems, domestic governance issues they have with communist rule there, it looks like India is on the cusp of something great and something big. So why do you think this is happening now?
So I think there are two dimensions to this. One is the possibility side, and one is the outcome side. I think the possibilities is, as you talked about it, a confluence of circumstances, a combination of Indian policies, but also how the world and particularly key countries are seeing the strategic and economic landscape and technological landscape that are making this almost a perfect storm in a good way for India, where it stands at the possibilities of being able to take advantage of the global situation. And some of those dimensions are that India for the world seems to have come out of COVID in a better situation relative to others in the economic side, and a combination of, again, macroeconomic management of those policies, of actually being able to kind of vaccinate a large number of Indians and therefore health recovery. Also kind of, you see, this is relative. So, China a little bit at the back foot, both on the economic and health side as well, facing headwinds. There's also the dimension, other than kind of on the economic side, where you see where countries see a willingness on the part of India, for example, for this government, which had not really been keen on free trade agreements, now keen on doing free trade agreements. And then I think you also see finally a desire on the part of key countries who see India both as a crucial strategic and economic partner, but also crucially potentially an alternative. And why are they now looking for alternatives? One is they are looking for to make their own supply chains resilient. That is that they can be, they shouldn't be vulnerable to the kind of external shocks that became apparent as a result of three different circumstances. One was COVID, when supply chains which were over-dependent on China became strained. Second, the kind of China itself, concerns about China, will it use countries' dependence for kind of political and economic leverage. And third, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fallout of that, where suddenly every country, including India, is concerned about having supply chains and not depending on one country, not becoming over-dependent. So in this dimension, India suddenly becomes attractive to other countries, but also the fact that countries are thinking about who are trusted friends. So it's not just diversifying, having China plus one strategies. Who are the countries that are trusted? Friendshoring is the term you'll hear these days.
Yeah, Janet Yellen's been
exactly.
using it, yeah.
And the idea is that you don't want to just move to another country. You want to move even your economic and technological options, alternatives, to countries that you trust. And this is where India is seen as a trusted partner. But beyond kind of looking for supply chains, I think India in its own right, because of something Prime Minister Modi has talked about in the past, the 3 Ds, democracy, demography and demand, if as long as India delivers on each of these fronts, in and of itself, it is attractive as a strategic economic and technological partner. Let me just say briefly kind of the outcome dimension. The historian in me always thinks about the fact that we have actually been at these moments where people have said India is on the cusp of something. If you look at the late 1950s, early 1960s, if you look at even the mid to late 2000s, there was this idea that, it's India's moment. The investment banks you talked about, they all talked about it. But there is kind of, how do you take this potential moment and actually make sure it turns into outcomes?
That's the biggest challenge, in fact, and that's something Prime Minister Modi has the goal of a Viksit Bharat or a developed India by 2047, and of course a leading power. These two go hand in hand, leading power and a developed nation with a high per capita income. And to deliver on this, the next 25 years, what we call Amrit Kal, is really very crucial indeed. Viewers, we have already spoken about why India is like the flavor of the moment internationally. And obviously, as Dr. Madan already mentioned, it's a lot to do with the economy and the bounce in the economy and the projections about the Indian economy. On this, I have very interesting comments by India's Minister for Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal. Let's hear him and continue the discussion.
You're all aware of the game-changing economic reforms that have happened in India, be it GST, be it IBC, be it the effort to decriminalize laws and make it easier to do business, the fact that we are trying to reduce compliances significantly, the low corporate tax for new businesses coming into India, the removal of the dividend distribution tax, which was a deterrent for international investment into India because A, they were paying almost 22% on their dividends, B, that was not getting a tax set off on the DTAA, the single window that we have tried to create, all of these are clearly pointing to a very renewed enthusiasm in India to expand the frontiers of business, economic activity. I very often said that as growth rates in India are suggesting, we will be a $30 trillion economy in the next 30 years. And for a chartered accountant, it's not very difficult to figure it out. You take a 8% growth rate and extrapolate the current $3.3 trillion economy, and you are looking at 30 trillion at a very conservative end. You'd probably see the CII has projected it to be anywhere between 35 and $45 trillion by 2047. That's in 25 years.
So mammoth figures, viewers, imagine a 35 to $40 trillion Indian economy. That's a more than tenfold increase that's being projected, Dr. Madan. And a lot of reforms Minister Goyal has been talking about, which are enabling these. And of course, India is also becoming more attractive, as we've spoken, for international investors as well. So and if you compare it to China's rise as well, how did China become a great power from what used to be a middle power? it was clearly largely driven by large-scale integration into the global economy and the convergence of Western capital and Chinese labor and manufacturing, right? So we seem to be definitely on the cusp of a similar kind of a breakout moment, and you see that with the statistics the minister is talking about. And you are in the US and US business community, the chambers, all of them are pretty bullish about India. And it looks like, and it's across the world, you find wherever there are big sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East, they're all talking about, India is the next big, attractive opportunity. So I think, as Bill Clinton would say, it's the economy is stupid. And that on that front, it does look like finally, as one scholar put it, the elephant is finally dancing and it's moving much faster than before.
So I think, there are the aspects of this will be, can India take sufficient advantage of the window of opportunity that these next few years represent? The global trends are in India's favor. Can India do what China did? Which is what, as you're describing what China did, it was essentially saying, not being concerned about what will the world do to us and therefore stay closed, what can the world do for us? And therefore being secure that India itself can engage with the world on its own terms, but not to the extent that there will not be an openness, because no country is going to give you advantage unless it feels that it's going to be beneficial for them. Same with companies. So the trends are in India's favor. Two things I think will determine whether or not India can take advantage of this window of opportunity. I think one is India's policies itself. And I think the crucial aspect there is, as the minister was talking about, what India aspires to, there will be a difference in terms of where India can get if it's growing at 5% annually, or if it's growing at 8% that he mentioned. This will make a difference to how attractive India is, as well as the, will India deliver in the reforms he's talking about. So this aspect of India's policy, can India take advantage at this moment before this window of opportunity closes and other countries become more attractive? I think the second aspect is global headwinds. How will India deal with some of these strategic potentially issues that arise, whether that is China-US competition, whether it is the fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how long the war in Europe lasts, whether it could be commodity prices, debt sustainability of several other countries, even though India is well placed there. And then, finally, these issues of several of India's markets. While India might be in a relatively decent economic situation today, several of India's crucial markets in the West, potentially will they suffer economic headwinds?
If they're in recession,
that's right.
Obviously it takes two to tango, and we need actually growth to happen around the world for our export. For example, Minister Goyal has been talking about how our exports are booming and have hit record levels, and a lot of it is dependent on the global situation as well. And I think that's a test, isn't it, where we are able to also shape an order. I mean, through all these multilateral leadership forums like G20 and so on, which are right now, focusing on India's leadership, we're trying to create a relatively stable world order, which is conducive for our growth to happen. And I think that will be a litmus test for leadership.
I think that India, from the moment it became independent, was very clear, and has been, I think, for 75 years, that it wants to shape the environment in which it operates, the global and regional environment. Because I think Indian leaders have understood that what happens outside, they talk about the Vegas rules, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. This is the opposite. What happens in the world, India has realized, doesn't stay in the world. It will affect India's own strategic and economic opportunities. The difference today is that India, while it always aspired to global leadership, to kind of organizations, for example, even being the voice of what was then called kind of the G77 or the non-alignment movement, or for example, the Afro-Asian. At that time, India was aspiring diplomatically, but it was punching above its weight, as they said.
Minimal resources.
Today, India does have capabilities, more capabilities than it had then. It is at its peak in terms of power on various metrics. So the question is, can it take those capabilities and this kind of historic ability, diplomatic ability, and heft, and a desire of the world to have India at the table, can it use these kind of 3 or 4 different things to actually shape that environment. Now, one thing I think India will also face, which I think many leaders acknowledge, is that India can't shape it entirely, but it's a question of, for example, trying to achieve peace and stability in the world, not for this just for the sake of peace and stability, but a region and a globe in which there is war. As the Prime Minister said, why does he say this is not should not be an era of war? Because he has talked about, since he came to power, there should be countries that have a development mindset, not an expansionist mindset. Because in a world in which countries, especially those around India, have expansionist mindsets, that's not a world that is conducive to India's own aspirations.
It's not a world, but we're still trying to be able to navigate these, troubled waters. The UN Secretary General, viewers, says that we are living in the gravest moment of maximum geopolitical discord and division, and that it's a matter of great concern for all of us. So how we navigate this really going to be one of the yardsticks by which India as a leading power is going to be measured. On this, viewers, I have interesting comments by India's External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar about why India matters more in the world today and how it's stepping up to take greater responsibilities. Let's watch him.
We see a growing recognition in the world that India is now getting its act together. Equally, there is a realization that the big issues of our times cannot be solved without India's contribution or participation. This is a moment when India resets the terms of engagement with the world. It is also a juncture where we should be prepared to take up greater responsibilities. So, for those who are starting off in life, like so many of you, I can only say that there is every reason to be confident. India today has a leadership and a vision, as well as the perseverance and the commitment to enhance its global standing. To those more experienced who've been part of our national journey for the last 75 years, they will surely appreciate the transformation underway and the opportunities that it has generated, opportunities perhaps that my generation did not have. But to all of them, I would only say that I'm sure that they share the conviction that today India matters more in the world, and we must make the most of it.
You heard India's External Affairs Minister saying we must make the most of this moment. Dr. Madan, talking of the geopolitical aspect, I mean, that's, you've already mentioned the headwinds, but there's also India which is more confident about alignments, if not formal alliances. And that's been one of the big, transformative elements of this leading power narrative, isn't it? That India is more confident, not just about foreign investment, but also in deciding where to align. And that is a fundamental aspect of grand strategy. And on that front, we seem to be, with the Quad going, and there's also many other relationships coming around in the Indo-Pacific, playing the power politics game also, much more confidently than before, isn't it? So taking responsibilities to shore up the regional order, that's also a sign of a leading power, isn't it?
I think it is, as the External Affairs Minister said, this question of confidence in what you do with it. Towards the end of that quote, he said, India must make the most of it. I think that is also a reflection of the recognition that there's nothing natural about it. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take the ability to make choices. And I think there's also, for example, a recognition over the last kind of 2 decades in India that whether it's protecting India's security or, for example, economic growth, prosperity for as many Indians, for all Indians for that matter, but also trying to be at the kind of technological leading edge. In an ideal world, India might want to do all of this on its own. But in the short to medium term, India is going to need partners to achieve those objectives. And the confidence to say that I am willing to partner with these countries, even if it means moving away from kind of a pure strategic autonomy goal. that
Yeah.
sometimes alignment is necessary to get to more autonomy, because the world can help you build your internal capabilities. So in some ways, it might sound that it's the opposite, but essentially taking, in some ways, learning from what China did in the 1980s with its economy, but taking advantage of propitious moments in the world to use your partner's desire to engage with you to build your own capabilities, to contribute to the world, and sometimes make hard choices, which means sometimes you cannot walk a middle path. For India's own interests, it means making choices. And so whether that's economic choices, whether that's strategic choices, I think the recognition, hence some of the relationships you talked about, whether it is with the US, with France, with countries like Israel, Australia, Japan,
Yeah.
the UK, others, this idea, and maintaining India's relationship with Russia for that matter, and even continuing to engage with China economically despite the headwinds in that relationship, the understanding that you need kind of the world to grow even as you make yourself more resilient to the headwinds that the world might pose for you as you open up.
And you need certain partners for certain reasons and for in certain issue areas. And so it's a complex arena where they're not necessarily just two camps, like a Chinese camp or an American camp, but India is trying to extract the maximum utility from whoever it engages with, and that seems to be the right thing for a rising middle power, which is projected to become a great power or leading power. Dr. Madan, on the security and the military front, India has been trying to also modernize its military, and that's again a big element of the way you measure comprehensive national power. And is for a long time we've been dependent on imports of major weaponry, but now slowly you see some landmark projects. For example, we have now gotten our own indigenously built aircraft carrier. That's a showpiece item, but there's much more that's being done. And there also the technology and the co-production and joint development with key partners, including the US, is critical, isn't it, for us to become a military power. Right now, if you see most of the rankings, even in Asia, after China, India is the biggest military power. But then to be a global power, to be leading power on the international arena, we need a lot more catch up to do, isn't there, on that front?
I think so. I think India's challenge to some extent is that it is trying to enhance its military capabilities, reform and modernize kind of the military structure, even as it is facing military challenges at its border, both kind of maritime and territorial. And so that is always kind of a bit challenging as you're trying to do both. Having said that, for the same reasons we talked about in terms of a window of opportunity, if India can make the most of a world where you have key countries who are actually invested in the idea of India being able to protect its own security and therefore then contribute to a larger global commons, they will today be willing to, for example, co-develop, co-produce in a way that might not have been, transfer technology in a way that might not have been possible in the past. Having said that, India itself will have to figure out, you can't have perfect be the enemy of the good. So you might not have countries who say, we'll give you all the technology or all the kind of co-development and co-production we'll transfer to India. Countries are not going to necessarily transfer over-dependence on China with over-dependence on India for supply chains. But for India to become a crucial part of global supply chains, even in the defense sales and trade side, but also to be able to export. The Prime Minister has talked about wanting to export defense equipment. India has already started
and the
to
figures
do it.
are ticking up.
Absolutely. Some of that is not full full platforms. It is components, with India becoming part of that supply chain. That's possible, but it will also require some compromise where you're not going to get 100% kind of reshoring. That it will be a combination of reshoring, onshoring, doing things in India, and engaging with friendshoring, that is working with trusted partners. So that means partners have to build trust with India, but India also has to build trust with these various crucial partners.
Absolutely. And last point, Dr. Madan, is also just a general boldness and assertiveness in foreign policy. I mean, that's being increasingly noticed with India, and you've already mentioned how we have stuck to our core relationships without coming under the sway or the pressure of any power block. And that is a sign of a leader, and that's something one would expect to going forward, because India has had a stable polity with a strong center since 2014. And clearly on that domestic front, looking forward, to the decades forward, we don't know what is going to happen after 2024 or 2029. But surely that aspect seems to be making it an island of stability also, because a lot of democracies are in trouble and are struggling with extreme polarization and breakdown and all. But India seems to be, has got sufficient consensus domestically that we are going in one path, and there's enough of a majority that's very keen that we should rise up to this level of a leading power, isn't it? So that seems like a solid base on which you can build the continuity, because in the past democracy you'd have flip-flops and policy changes every 4 or 5 years, but it looks like that's one reason why we seem to be more formidable, isn't it?
So I think, I don't buy the line that some authoritarian regimes have put out, including from Beijing, that democracies are in crisis. If anything, if you look at the situation today, it is democracies that manage to vaccinate their populations and have come out of this crisis with more effectiveness than some other countries.
Far better than the Chinese, yeah.
It is democracies that have produced more effective vaccines. It is democracies that are still, for example, trying to solve the issues of kind of food security, for example, in the world. So I don't buy this line that I think democracies over time tend to be more stable, more able, more transparent.
Yeah.
And so even if you're a business, the attractiveness, yes, sometimes you can go to authoritarian country and from the top you think there'll be more certainty. But you never know what's going to happen 5 years down the line.
That's right.
With democracies, that there might be minor flip-flops, but over time, they tend to be more resilient. Policy tends to be more sustainability,
yeah,
because you have bought in, you have taken the public along. You have to make compromises along the way. You have to actually make these things sustainable. So I actually think, you've seen a situation now where there are a lot of things in place where India can take advantage.
And democracy can be an advantage, says Dr. Tanvi, Madan, viewers, and the point is, after the United States, there's a realistic possibility in a decade or two that we will see the second genuine democratic superpower, great power or leading power of our times. I want to thank Dr. Tanvi Madan for excellent insights. Thank you so much. The audience learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaulia.
So viewers, India as a leading power is work in progress, but there are a lot of positive signals and symbols out there, and it's time for us to latch on to them and to believe in this idea and to will it into a reality. So do think about India's rise as a leading power. I'll see you again next time. Until then, keep watching Doordarshan. Take care.